Whenever you are.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, I have journalist Ben Norton with me today, and I really appreciate him coming in. So I am going to extend him an extra special thank you because he came in at the last minute. So, Ben, thank you very much.
Of course. Thanks for having me anytime.
So Ben, you can find Ben at the Real News Network. You're a writer also. It's a journalist and writer, correct?
Yeah. And I also help edit the website, The Gray Zone, with Max Blumenthal, a
That's
colleague of
right.
mine. You can find that at grayzoneproject.com.
Yeah, Max is amazing too. Both of you guys do amazing work.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to keep this rather straightforward because people know me. I can be long-winded. So I'm going to ask these. One is a little bit more expansive. The other two are pretty straightforward. So it's mainly two questions with a third follow-up that you may know that I don't know. So the first one, we're talking about Venezuela. And currently in Venezuela, I got to be honest, it's beginning to look a lot like Iraq, where I was watching C-SPAN earlier today, where you had the person, talking in the UN thing. Ultimately, it looks like a slow-moving coup where the United States has ignored the fact that Maduro was elected and has just said we're going to pretend that the other guy is the interim president of the country, and military stay with Maduro. But this looks bad, and it's clear that the United States is trying to foment a coup within the country itself. Now, how do we get here? And I mean this however you want to go with this, whether you want to talk about Chavez, whether you want to talk about Maduro, whether he's what they say he is, like however you want to answer that. How did we arrive at this point where it seems like the United States is literally trying to topple the government of Venezuela?
Well, this isn't even the first time the U.S. has backed a coup. We need to be clear about that. In 2002, the U.S. also backed a military coup that ousted then President Hugo Chavez, who was democratically elected numerous times, widely recognized by the Carter Center, for instance, founded by former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, as free and fair elections. The Carter Center monitored the 1998 and the 2000 presidential elections in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez won them both, handily, and the Carter Center that they were the freest and fairest elections they had monitored in the world at the time. But that didn't stop the Bush administration from overthrowing the elected government in 2002 and briefly installing a right-wing oligarch, Pedro Carmona. And what we're seeing now is something very similar. The difference now is the situation is more difficult, much more difficult economically. There certainly is an economic crisis in Venezuela, but much of that is not caused by the government, although, the government has certainly made mistakes, and there's certainly much to criticize. But a lot of that's actually been caused by essentially an economic war waged by the U.S. on Venezuela, crippling sanctions and other forms of sabotage. We can get to that in a moment. But the point we need to understand is that there's a historical context here, and the Trump administration is using this pretense of saving democracy and authoritarianism. Obviously, this is absurd considering, this is after Trump sword danced with the Saudi monarchy, considering the U.S. has for decades propped up right-wing dictators throughout Latin America. But even more than that, the point I'm trying to express here is that this isn't even the first coup in the past 20 years in Venezuela that the U.S. has supported. This is the second coup, at least, and there are other failed coup attempts in the past. So we really need to understand it in that historical context. Now, why? It's pretty clear why. Venezuela has pursued a path independent of U.S. imperialism for the past 20 years. In 1998, Venezuela democratically elected Hugo Chavez from the United Socialist Party, who has pursued a path independent for the past 20 years from the U.S. sphere of influence. He withdrew Venezuela from the World Bank and IMF, and he created the Bank of the South to encourage inter-South, South-South integration and to resist these US-dominated neoliberal financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. He kicked out the oil companies, the US oil companies from Venezuela that had been dominating this country for decades. And he nationalized large elements of the oil industry, nationalized the oil resources. Venezuela has the largest oil resources in the entire world, more
Wow.
than Saudi Arabia, and used that wealth to fund strong social programs to support poor and working class Venezuelans. And of course, anytime a government in Latin America tries to exercise this independent path away from US dominated institutions and away from capitalism, they always find themselves under the thumb of the US empire. This has happened again and again and again. And it's really a very similar situation we're seeing today. The US, as you mentioned, along with its right-wing allies in the region, is trying to basically create its own opposition government in Venezuela
Mhm.
by illegally, in violation of international law, just discarding with the actual sovereign government that sits at the United Nations, that is recognized by the international community. Instead, the US and its right-wing allies, like Brazil, which just elected a fascist president, Colombia, and the other right wing governments in the region, the US is just trying to impose this unelected right wing opposition leader, Juan Guaido, as president. And Trump thinks he can just elect a foreign president by tweet. He doesn't care about the fact that millions of Venezuelans have participated in these electoral processes. And we can talk about those. It is true that Maduro was elected, but the opposition boycotted the most recent presidential election in May of
That's what I was going to
2013.
ask you. Yeah, it's two things. Well, one thing with that. Is it true that the United States was essentially, I don't know if it's true, but I'm leading into it, were essentially supporting opposition groups and giving them resources, weapons, and those type of things. And then once Maduro reacts to this, turns around and says, he's killing his own people, he's injuring his own people. We need to do something about the fact that there's massacres and that type of stuff. Um, Also, like you said, this was an election where the U.S. pushed the opposition not to participate, so it could later turn around and say he's a usurper within the electoral process. Is that true, false, somewhere in between?
Absolutely. First of all, we need to understand that even before Nicolas Maduro, the current president, when you had Hugo Chavez in power, corporate media outlets, the US government, right wingers, they all smeared him, even Bernie Sanders, unfortunately, as a dictator. And he was not a dictator. Hugo Chavez won 6 elections and referenda between 1998 and his death in 2013. He won them fair and square. International observers said that they were fair elections. And then in 2013, after Hugo Chavez died, they had another presidential election, and Nicolas Maduro won that election, which again was recognized to be fair. Now, since then, the situation has become much more difficult. There certainly is an economic crisis in Venezuela. The price of oil has dropped drastically, which has really hurt the Venezuelan economy, which 95% of Venezuela's exports are oil. So it's a very oil-based economy, and that is among other reasons, including US sanctions, including mistakes by the government, that has certainly led to an economic crisis in the country. Although we can't ignore the fact that the US sanctions have made this much worse. And the US has been waging an economic war on Venezuela. And then it's pointing to Venezuela and saying, well, we helped create this mess, but we now need to uninstall the actual legitimate president and install this illegitimate opposition in order to fix those economic problems. But actually, again, the US played a key role in creating those problems. Not the lone role, but a key role. So
Yeah.
anyway, now the 2018 election in May, like you said, the opposition boycotted it. And then the mainstream opposition boycotted it and said, Maduro, this is not a fair election because he just ran against these few opposition figures people didn't really know. Well, it's not the first time either. The opposition also boycotted the 2017 election for the Constituent Assembly. And the Constituent Assembly, I don't have time to get into the history of that, but the Constituent Assembly was created as this kind of democratic institution to bring the opposition and the government together, to provide this more democratic framework and to ultimately write a new constitution. And the opposition boycotted that and refused to recognize the Constituent Assembly as a state institution. And instead, the opposition used the National Assembly, which it won fair and square in the 2015 elections. So we keep hearing Venezuela dictatorship. Well, actually, the opposition freely won the 2015 legislative elections for the National Assembly and has continued to wage war against the state ever since then, operating as a kind of parallel government within the actual government. So that's what we see again and again and again. The opposition claims that the government is a regime and it's not democratic. The reality is they are the ones who have been trying to subvert democracy at every single level. And the person that they have chosen, not even just they have chosen, but the US government,
Yeah.
primarily the US government, has chosen. A Wall Street Journal report showed that the US has been planning this coup for months, working with other right-wing governments in the region, like Brazil and Colombia, and Canada as well, the liberal government in Canada of Justin Trudeau. They all work together to single out this young 35-year-old opposition leader, Juan Guaido, and say he's president, but actually he's less popular than Maduro. And the opposition-led National Assembly is less popular than Maduro. Even pro-opposition polling firms like Data Analysis, which is a major polling firm in Venezuela, which is very sympathetic to the opposition, even they have acknowledged that the opposition-controlled National Assembly has around 25% approval,
Oh,
which
geez.
is less than the president, Nicolas Maduro. And another recent poll in early January found that this young supposed interim president, Juan Guaido, in fact, 81% of Venezuelans didn't even know who he was before the US appointed this guy their supposed president.
That's amazing. Wow, that's absolutely amazing. And then with the part where people were like, we don't even know who this guy is, and this guy is now president of Venezuela, supposedly president of Venezuela. Two questions. Do you think that there's going to be a splintering between the military within the standpoint of the government? Because my understanding is the military is backing Maduro on this particular point, but there's, fear that the military could be, sheared off where there's certain elements, at least that's my fear anyway, that there's certain elements that back Maduro, certain elements that back Juan, and you end up with this kind of crisis situation of a conflict, like a war, like an open civil war of sorts.
Well, unfortunately, that's a very real possibility, and we should be extremely concerned. And that's why we should be speaking out, because really this could lead to a war like we saw in Syria or Libya inside Venezuela. And frankly, if you look at the people the Trump administration have put in charge of this, like Elliot Abrams, the Trump administration just announced that Elliot Abrams is going to be special envoy to Venezuela. Abrams is an arch neocon. This is one of the key figures in the Iran-Contra scandal, infamously, one of the key figures who helped lead the U.S. dirty wars, the regime change wars on Nicaragua and El Salvador under the Reagan administration in the 1980s, where the U.S. was funding death squads that were massacring civilians to try to destabilize these governments. This is also a figure, Elliot Abrams, who supported the U.S.-backed Guatemalan military junta, which committed literal genocide. The United Nations said that the US-backed Guatemalan military regime committed actual genocide, murdering Maya indigenous people in the name of defeating communism. This guy, Elliot Abrams, is now Trump's special envoy for Venezuela policy. Elliot Abrams also previously backed the 2002 US-backed military coup in Venezuela. So it's very clear that regime change is 100% their priority. They're already essentially, not only have they tried to declare a coup, the US is basically leading this coup. The US, we now know from the Wall Street Journal and other reports, Associated Press, the US, Canada, Brazil, Colombia, they were regularly corresponding with opposition leaders.
Venezuela.
Mike Pence personally called Juan Guaido and said, if you declare yourself president, we will recognize you immediately. And they all did. Minutes after Juan Guaido said he's president, the US and numerous countries recognized him, including, again, I need to stress this point, the current president of Brazil, who is a fascist, Jair Bolsonaro. He's a right-wing extremist who supports military dictatorship. He wants to restore the military dictatorship in Brazil. Most infamously, this is a guy who he told a female lawmaker in Brazil that she didn't deserve to be raped because
Yeah, I
she's
saw
too
that.
ugly. This is a guy who said he would never want his son marrying a black woman because she's not smart enough, is what he said. He's just a complete racist. He said that would rather his son die than be gay. And the most egregious of all is that Bolsonaro, the Brazilian president, who is strongly backed by the US, he said that the only problem he had with the Chilean military dictatorship under the junta of Pinochet was that Pinochet didn't kill enough people for his taste.
Yeah,
So
Bolsonaro is nuts.
this is the person that is supposedly defending democracy in Venezuela as a fascist in alliance with Donald Trump. So again, I know I'm ranting here, but
No, you're right.
I'll answer your question directly about the military. So, I laid out why this is so dangerous. And fortunately, what we have seen is that the military has not splintered and has not incited a war yet, because that would be catastrophic for everyone, especially throughout the region. It would lead to something like Syria, where you have hundreds of thousands of people killed, millions of people become refugees. And Donald Trump is doing all this anti-refugee and anti-immigrant rhetoric. It's a huge part of his campaign, but he's going to create more and more refugees and immigrants by fueling this instability and chaos and a potential war inside a country with 32 million people in Venezuela. This is a huge country, and it's right, it's very close to the US, unlike Syria, which is on the other side of the planet. So we haven't seen major military defections, but reporting like this Wall Street Journal report and other mainstream media reports have shown that Trump administration officials are trying to encourage rank and file troops from the Venezuelan military to defect and to essentially join the opposition and wage war against the state, which is how the war in Syria began. The US and Saudi Arabia and other countries were encouraging people from the Syrian Arab army to leave the army and to take up arms against the state and create the so-called Free Syrian Army. So fortunately, the situation in Venezuela has not militarized to that degree yet. But unfortunately, the very real possibility for a bloody civil war is definitely on the table. And in the words of the Trump administration, for them, all options are on the table,
Well,
including
the
military
actions
war.
itself kind of pushes that behavior. Like it's like the behavior is somewhat incentivized just by the virtue of the situation. We've had, from the standpoint of the United States, we've had one bloody coup after the next that the CIA implemented throughout South America. Brazil, Bolivia, let's say El Salvador, Guatemala, and it's known. Like, this is not something that's a secret. This is not something that nobody knows. We install dictators after essentially overthrowing the left-leaning governments under this idea that we're fighting communism. Same thing with, like you said, what's taking place in Brazil. We're perfectly okay with Erdogan. We're perfectly okay with Saudi Arabia. We're okay with Bahrain. We don't have an issue against terrorists. I mean, so we don't have an issue against dictators. In fact, we love dictators because you pay them and they can control a population. You can have a certain domination. So this on its face is nonsense. Like, the Tillerson memo came out saying that the only reason that the United States does things is because it's in the United States' interests, not necessarily humanitarian. Humanitarian is just the club that he uses to club people. Now, the fact that you had to send that memo in and of itself is a little weird. People should have known that, but that's the reality of it. Despite that, which again is not secret, it's not something that's hidden away or anything like that. You had one story after the next, like you were saying, where Mike Pompeo and all were saying that they were trying to topple the government. You've had John Bolton saying he wants to topple the government of Iran. Like, these people are very clear in their intentions on trying to take down the government of another country. The media, you would think, would know this. Seeing as the media, this is pretty straightforward. So, and I always have this question: are they lying or are they incompetent? Like, is the media working as this kind of like the Chomsky, this manufacturing consent? What the United States is doing is right by definition, even if the United States is helmed by Donald Trump himself, and even if you know that these guys are straight neocons and are trying to take down the country legally. Are they lying or are they incompetent? Which one is it? You may know, you're in the media probably more than I am. Am I insane on this?
No, there's a trick question. It's a loaded question, and the answer is neither. Of course, there is no shortage of lies, and there is definitely no dearth of incompetence. There's certainly a lot of both of those to go around in the corporate media, but you hit the nail on the head, and it's the Chomskyan model, and also Edward Herman, because everyone always forgets the lead author of Manufacturing Consent it was not just Chomsky, it was Herman. But their model is 100% accurate. It's more accurate now. There's a variety of factors, but one, these are corporate media outlets. And ultimately, at the end of the day, their primary goal is not to inform people, it is to make money. We live in a capitalist system, and corporate media function to make profit. And they're not interested in challenging anything that could actually hurt their bottom line.
Yeah.
And going against the US government can really hurt your bottom line in the long term. But also, like you said, in many ways, the US media acts as a kind of stenographer to power, a stenographer for the US State Department. Really, journalists kind of rewrite government press releases. Journalists are always looking for nice, spicy scoops. And if a government official wants to unofficially or even officially leak something to you, That's a great scoop. It's very easy as a reporter. You don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to get off the ground. You can just stick in your office in the New York Times or the Washington Post
Yeah.
and be fed this information and then be praised for this explosive scoop based on anonymous U.S. officials. So there are just so many levels of mutual reinforcement, and that's why we virtually never see corporate media deviate from the U.S. government line. I mean, whether it's the war in Iraq, the 2011 regime change war in Libya, the war in Syria, and now in Venezuela. I mean, you can go down the list. Show me an example of a war that the New York Times editorial board did not endorse, or that the
Well, they would
Washington
endorse it
Post
in the
did not
moment.
endorse.
Later on, they'll endorse it in a moment. Later on, they'll be like, "Hey, maybe that was an accident." It's like, yeah, you're talking about that 40 years later. In the
Yeah.
moment, they always
No,
back
they
it.
endorse every
Yeah,
single war and military intervention and coup and regime change that the US government supports, including under Donald Trump. In fact, the only time the Washington Post editorial board praises Trump is when he bombs a foreign country, when he expands a war, when he et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's when they praise the US president, they support the policy, and then maybe if you're lucky, 5 or 10 years later, they'll publish a mea culpa and said, sorry,
all right.
actually, this war was based on lies, like all of them. Sorry, we helped facilitate a war that killed millions of people, that plunged a country into chaos, that destroyed an independent sovereign nation in the global south so multinational corporations can exploit its natural resources. Sorry, we'll do better next time. And they never do.
Last question: is there any reality to it? So, is there like I know there are economic sanctions, and I know there was probably mismanagement. Um, it's always rich that people call other governments corrupt. That always trips me out. But is there any level of reality to what's taking place? And I don't mean this in a sandbox. Like oftentimes media takes this stuff and says, "Hey, look at what's taking place in this sandbox world of so and so." It's like, yeah, but you're not really giving the larger context of what's and why and that type of stuff. I just mean from the standpoint of this narrative that media is running with, is there any reality to the narrative itself?
Well, certainly, Venezuela is going through an economic crisis. That's
Yes.
absolutely
Yes.
true. Uh, Although we need to understand the historical context, again, the situation for the average working class Venezuelan now is still much, even amid with this economic crisis, it's still much better than it was before the initiation of the Bolivarian Revolution in 1998.
Yeah.
In the 1980s and 90s, when you had this right-wing neoliberal government, and even before that with the military junta, they didn't care about working class Venezuelans. And it's not even just a matter of economic exploitation. Another interesting factor to look at in terms of Venezuela is the extreme racism in the opposition, where Maduro is a former bus driver. He's dark skinned. Hugo Chavez came from the military and was also from a poor family and dark skinned. The elites in Venezuela are almost all very light-skinned European, and a lot of the rhetoric they have against Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro and against their supporters is very racist.
Yeah.
And you can just see this reflected in the protests. There have been large anti-government protests and large pro-government protests. Both of them, of course, only the former gets covered in the US corporate media. The pro-government protests are mysteriously somehow ignored.
Yeah.
And you just look, the supporters of Maduro tend to be darker skin and poor and working class, and the supporters of the opposition tend to be white and rich, or at least middle class. So there are major divides in Venezuelan society. This is still a class society. It's not like Cuba. They didn't overthrow the previous government.
Mhm.
Instead, they had elections, and Hugo Chavez and Maduro won those elections. And they have always worked within this reformist framework. They have not waged an actual revolution to overthrow the existing capitalist state. They have created all of these socialist reforms within capitalism. So still the vast majority of the economy is controlled by private capitalists. There still are rich capitalists in Venezuela,
Very
and it's a
interesting.
constant struggle. And increasingly, the situation has become more difficult for a variety of reasons. Certainly, economic sabotage by the economic elites in Venezuela and by the US, but also certainly big mistakes and flaws committed by the government. One of the biggest being they thought the entire model of all this social spending to help poor people, all of these great healthcare clinics,
Mhm.
all this great education, all of these communal resources to help working class and poor Venezuelans, that was all funded basically with
Oil.
oil money.
Yeah.
And Venezuela, 95% of this country's exports are oil, are based on oil. 25% of the entire GDP is based on oil. And that worked when the price of oil was high, but the price of oil plummeted in 2014. And whether or not that was actually natural, I mean, to the extent that market forces can be natural, it's ridiculous economic understanding. But to the extent that that was natural is disputed. In fact, some analysts have suggested that the US pressured Saudi Arabia to overproduce oil in order to plunge the price of oil down, because when there's too much oil in the market, the price goes down, supply and demand, basic economics. And in response to that, the massive drop in prices, it hurt major oil-based economies that the US is trying to destabilize, not just Venezuela, but also
Russia.
Iran, Russia, and other countries. So certainly there are absolutely economic problems in Venezuela, but we have to understand both the internal and the external contradictions.
Yeah.
And there, no one is saying, including supporters of Maduro, that Maduro is perfect. He's far from it. What leader is? But the point is that in the context of the country, we have to understand it in the context of the history of Venezuela before 1998, when poor and working class Venezuelans lived in extreme poverty. There was massive illiteracy, no access to healthcare and education. And now, where there certainly are difficulties, certain goods are lacking, inflation is skyrocketing, but people still have access to healthcare. They still have access to education and to housing. Large numbers of houses were built. And then finally, one other point.
Mhm.
We always, when people talk, right wingers talk about the failures of the socialist government and blah, blah, blah. And of course, not only do they ignore the CIA's active sabotage, not
Yeah.
only do they ignore all these countries are under brutal US economic sanctions.
Yep.
Venezuela, Cuba has been under an embargo since 1961. Nicaragua is under sanctions. They're all under sanctions. Even non-socialist governments like Iran under brutal sanctions. Not only do the right wingers ignore that, but they always try to compare imperialist countries that have a history of hundreds of years of colonialism to struggling countries in the global south. And they
Yeah.
say, oh, well, you support socialism, go live in Venezuela, go live in
Venezuela.
Cuba.
Yeah.
Okay, so Cuba has the same history as the United States. Cuba has the same history as Britain and France. These are colonial powers that built much of their economy on exploitation and extraction from the global south. We can't compare Venezuela to the US. We have to compare Venezuela to its neighbors, to
Yes.
places like Colombia, to places like Mexico. And Mexico, this point is never made. Mexico has much worse poverty and much worse violence than Venezuela, even though I'm not disputing that Venezuela certainly has issues. I'm not
Yeah.
downplaying them. But we always hear the comparisons between Venezuela and the US, not Venezuela. It's not Venezuela to Mexico. It's apples and oranges. It needs to be apples to apples. And we need to understand that certainly this country is going through issues, but in the region, in the context, they're grossly exaggerated.
I agree with you. And I mean, oftentimes right wingers make that case that they're just being fishy. I mean, it's usually nonsense. And I would even go further, and I'll end it on this. Just even if something is going on in Venezuela, that's a secondary question of whether or not you go through intervening in Venezuela. Those are different things. Like, whatever is taking place in Venezuela is an issue for Venezuelans. It is not necessarily an issue for the United States to instigate itself in that country. And we've been doing that. And any honest, appraisal of whatever is taking place in Venezuela has to accept that a superpower has essentially made it its mission to destabilize and undermine the governments and even the societal structure itself of that country. And unless that's taken into account, it's not being an honest, portrayal of what's
Absolutely. Well, and one note in response to that, the framing of this, do you or do you not support intervention? I really despise the way that's framed, because the impression is always, one, that the US government actually cares what we think
right.
when it comes to these issues. And two, even more than that, this presupposition ignores the fact that the intervention is happening.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you support it or not. So whether or not you support it is irrelevant. What are you doing to oppose it is the real question. You can't just say, and this is an important discussion because a lot of people on the left have taken this, proxy on both their houses approach. Like they're
Mhm.
both equally bad. Like, yes, I oppose U.S. intervention in any country, X country, but that global South dictator is a cartoon villain. I mean, I recently joked this is the same thing, and is people who say, "Well, I'm not racist," but it's the same thing. I oppose U.S. military intervention, but this person is a horrible dictator and needs to be deposed.
Sanders.
Yeah,
Sanders did
I mean,
that.
if
I
you're
ripped him in that video because I could, and because I couldn't, I was like, you're waffling on this. Like you're doing this thing of he's a horrible, brutal, authoritarian dictator, but the United States should know better than intervening in countries. It's like, why are you giving them the first premise? Like, why even give them the first premise where you have to defend the second premise? You know what I mean? It's like if you're arguing about that, argue about the first premise before you even get to that conversation of whether or not you should intervene. No, I agree with you.
Yeah, exactly. And the point is, we have this really weird American understanding of politics where I mean, it's based on this myth that we live in some democratic society where we say, well, which policy do you support? And if you support it, blah 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 blah.
Yeah,
No, it doesn't matter if we support it. These policies are already happening. So the question is not do you support it? The question is what are you doing about it?
yeah,
Are you opposing it actively, or are you saying you don't agree with it? Those are two different things. And this comes down to the question of fighting any injustice, fighting sexism, fighting racism, fighting capitalism, any of these. It doesn't matter if you say, okay, well, I oppose sexism, racism, capitalism. Okay, fine. But what are you doing to fight sexism, racism, capitalism? So you can't just say, I oppose intervention. No, how are you actually opposing it? It's not a matter of just articulating your political views. And that's why we need to have an understanding that exposing what's actually happening, showing what's actually happening on the ground. And then, I mean, I'm not really an organizer, I'm a journalist, but people have different roles. But the most important thing of all is people organizing.
yeah.
And we need people to actually organize and revive anti-war and anti-interventionist movements like we had to to an extent. I mean, it was never strong in the US, but we certainly had at the time of the Iraq War. If
You
people
know,
say they oppose this Trump-led regime change, this Trump-led coup in Venezuela or any other country, what are they doing about it? Are they going to organize? Because that's what we need.
that's a good point. I mean, because at the point where we found out about it, they were already in the process of doing it. You know, it's I'm against this. It's like, yeah, but this is already taking place. Like it's no, I totally I'll feel you on that, dude. Thank you very much for coming on to the show. I really do appreciate it. Ben Norton, Real News Network, author, journalist, also from the Gray Zone. Ben, please tell them where they can. Well, I think I just did. But if there's anywhere else other than Real News Network and the Gray Zone that they can find you.
Absolutely, yeah. You can find a lot of my work at the Gray Zone, and that's grayzoneproject.com. I work with Max Blumenthal, and then the two of us also co-host a podcast and a video show. We recently moved to YouTube as well called Moderate Rebels. You can go to moderaterebels.com, and there's links there. So, man, thanks for having me. That was great.
No, dude, I really appreciate you coming on. All right, guys, I'm going to end this here. It's been a long day. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all. Let's see, this one.